Hello guys, let's learn about the humerus bone today. This is the humerus bone. As you can see in the diagram, this is the anterior view of the humerus bone and this is the posterior view. The humerus bone is the largest bone in the upper limb. It consists of three parts. The humerus bone can be divided into three parts: the upper end, the lower end, and the shaft. This is the upper end, this is the lower end, and this middle body of the bone is called the shaft. Again, from the posterior aspect, upper end, lower end, and the shaft. You should also note that the shaft is known as the diaphysis and the ends, both the ends, are known as epiphyses. Moving on to the site determination, you can easily determine whether the bone belongs to the right hand or the left hand by keeping in mind these 4 points. You can easily distinguish between the upper end and the lower end, of course, because the upper end consists of a rounded head and the lower end is expanded from side to side and it is flattened from before backwards. As you can see in the diagram that this is the upper end, which consists of the rounded head. Obviously the head is not visible because it is present inside the glenoid cavity. The glenoid cavity is the cavity in the scapula bone where the head of the humerus resides to form the shoulder joint. And this is the lower end, which is expanded from side to side. So this is the expanded end, you can see. The head is also directed medially, upward and backward, and the lesser tubercle is always present in the front of the upper end. Here is the lesser tubercle, which is present in the front or in the anterior aspect of the bone, of the upper end of the bone. And you can also note that the head is directed medially, which means towards the center of the body or towards the middle of the body. So if you keep the humerus bone on your hand, on your arm basically, in such a position that the head directs medially and the lesser tubercle is facing the front, you can easily determine whether the bone belongs to the right hand or the left hand. Moving on to the features of the humerus bone, talking about the upper end first. The upper end consists of the head, which is rounded, spherical, and larger than the glenoid cavity. It is directed medially, upward, and backward. It is present inside the glenoid cavity to make the shoulder joint. The humerus bone consists of three necks, namely the anatomical neck, the surgical neck, and the morphological neck. The anatomical neck is the line of attachment of capsule for the shoulder joint. It separates the head and the rest of the upper end. Let's mark it on the diagram now. As you can see, this red dotted line shows the anatomical neck. It shows the position of the anatomical neck, which separates the head from the rest of the upper end. Then we have the surgical neck. This name is given by the surgeons because it is the most common point of breaking of the humerus bone. It separates the upper end and the shaft. So this, as you can see, it is labeled that this is the surgical neck. This is the surgical neck which separates the upper end from the shaft. Then we have the morphological neck, which is 0.5 centimeter above the surgical line, and it is where the epiphyseal line exists. So again, if this is the surgical neck, Then 0.5 centimeter above, just a little above, we have the morphological neck where the epiphyseal line exists. Then we have the lesser tubercle. Tubercle is an elevation which is present on the anterior aspect of the upper end. It is also a point of site determination that the lesser tubercle or an elevation is present on the upper end in the anterior aspect of the bone. Then we have the greater tubercle, which is present in the lateral part of the upper end, and it is present in the posterior aspect. So here you can see this is the greater tubercle, which is present laterally. Laterally means away from the center of the body, and it is also clearly visible from the posterior aspect. Let's see here. Since this is the posterior aspect of the humerus bone, the greater tubercle is clearly visible on the posterior aspect. Then finally we have the intertubercular sulcus, which is also known as the bicipital groove. The tubercles are basically the points of elevations, and the sulcus or the groove are basically depressions. The name of this depression is intertubercular sulcus, or it can also be called as the bicipital groove, and it is the depression which is present between two elevated points on the upper end of the humerus bone, which are the lesser tubercle and the greater tubercle. Again, a very important point to be noted that the intertubercular sulcus or the bicipital groove is the point of depression which exists between two points of elevation, which are the lesser tubercle and the greater tubercle. The intertubercular sulcus consists of medial and lateral lips. Marking it here on the diagram, this is the lesser tubercle and this is the greater tubercle, and in between these two tubercles we have this depression or a groove called the bicipital groove or the intertubercular sulcus, and it consists of two lips, namely the medial lip and the lateral lip. This is the medial lip, this is the medial lip, and this is the lateral lip. The medial lip is basically a prolongation of the lesser tubercle, and the lateral lip is a prolongation of the greater tubercle. You should also note that the lateral lip is a continuation of the anterior border of the humerus bone. We will learn about the borders ahead. Let's move on to learn about the shaft or the body of the humerus bone. The upper half of the shaft is rounded and the lower half is triangular in shape, like this diagram here. And the shaft consists of three borders and three surfaces. This diagram gives us an idea about the lower part of the shaft of humerus, which is triangular in shape, and it is triangular and not rounded because of the presence of the borders and the surfaces, which are more prominent in the lower part or the lower half of the shaft. And since the borders and the surfaces are more prominent in the lower half, it is normally triangular in appearance. These three are the surfaces and these corners are the borders. The shaft of humerus consists of three borders. The anterior border, which is prolongation of the lateral lip, the lateral border, which is prominent only at the lower end and is a continuation of the lateral supracondylar ridge. The lateral border is continuous with the lateral supracondylar ridge, which is a feature of the lower end. We will learn about this ahead. And finally, we have the medial border, which is continuous with the medial supracondylar ridge. Three borders, let's locate them on the diagram now. So this is the anterior border, obviously, very clearly visible here. This is the anterior border, and it is a continuation of the lateral lip. The anterior border is continuous with the lateral lip of the intertubercular sulcus. Right? This is the medial border, and this is the lateral border. Again, very simply, the anterior border, the medial border, and the lateral border. Moving on to the surfaces of the shaft of humerus, there is anterior lateral surface, which is present between the anterior and the lateral border. And now, yeah, these points are very, very important to be noted. That on the anterior lateral surface, there is the presence of a V-shaped deltoid tuberosity. It can be asked in the form of an MCQ that where is the deltoid tuberosity present on the shaft of humerus? So you must know that it is present on the anterior lateral surface. The deltoid tuberosity is also the point of insertion of the deltoid muscle. And just behind this deltoid tuberosity, there is a groove present on the posterior surface of the shaft of humerus, and this groove is known as the radial groove or the spinal groove. Then secondly, we have the anteromedial surface, which lies between the anterior and the medial border, and in its upper one third it forms the floor of the intertubercular sulcus, and it is also the surface where the nutrient foramen is present. Again, very important points to be noted, that what features are present on which surface. Then the posterior surface, thirdly, there is the posterior surface, which lies between the medial and the lateral border, and in its middle one third it is crossed by the radial groove. This same groove we talked about here, which is present behind the deltoid tuberosity. Let me just quickly recall all the points. So, the shaft of humerus consists of three surfaces: the anterior lateral surface, which consists of the deltoid tuberosity; the anterior medial surface, which consists of the floor of the intertubercular sulcus and the nutrient foramen; and finally the posterior surface, which is crossed by the radial groove. You can see in the diagram here, as we discussed, that this is the anterior border and this is the medial border, and in between these two borders, this surface is called as anteromedial surface. This surface present between the anterior border and the lateral border is called the anterolateral surface, and the surface which is behind all these structures is called the posterior surface. Here it is visible in this diagram that this is the posterior surface of the shaft of humerus. This is the shaft of humerus. This is the posterior surface, and here you can see the presence of the radial groove. The radial groove is present just behind this V-shaped deltoid tuberosity. The radial groove, which is present on the posterior surface in the middle one third. So this is the posterior surface and this is the middle one third. This is the upper one third. You can divide the shaft into upper one third. This is the middle one third, and this is the lower one third. So yeah, in the middle one third we have got the radial groove on the posterior surface of the shaft of humerus. Alright, let's learn about the features of the lower end of humerus. These can get a little tricky, but try to memorize all these names, alright? So firstly we have the capitulum, the trochlea, then there's the medial epicondyle, the lateral epicondyle, the lateral supracondylar ridge, the medial supracondylar ridge, the coronoid fossa, and the radial fossa. So these are all the features of the lower end of humerus. Let's locate them on the bone. Here is the anterior view of the lower end of humerus. Here's the trochlea. This is the trochlea. This entire condyle is the trochlea, and this is the capitulum, and these two are basically the condyles of humerus. The trochlea is the medial condyle and the capitulum is the lateral condyle. Then we have fossas or surfaces. The surface just above the trochlea is where the coronoid process of ulna bone resides when the arm is flexed or when the elbow joint is flexed. Hence it is known as the coronoid fossa. And just lateral to the coronoid fossa, above the capitulum, we have the radial fossa. It is where the head of the radial bone resides when the elbow joint is flexed. Hence it is known as the radial fossa. And just above the condyles, we have the epicondyles. This is the medial epicondyle, which is above the medial condyle, also called the trochlea. And just above the lateral condyle, called the capitulum, we have the lateral epicondyle. And now just above the epicondyles, we have the supraepicondyles. So this is the supraepicondylar ridge, and this is the lateral supraepicondylar ridge. This is the anterior aspect of the lower end of humerus. Let's quickly recall all the features again. So to begin with, the condyles. Here are the two condyles. The medial condyle is called the trochlea and the lateral condyle is called capitulum. Just above these condyles, we have two fossas named as the coronoid fossa, which is called the coronoid fossa basically because of the coronoid process of ulna, which resides or which comes in contact with this fossa when the elbow joint is flexed. And just above the capitulum, we have the radial fossa, which is where the head of the radius bone comes in contact when the elbow joint is flexed. And now above the condyles, above the two condyles, we have the epicondyle. Above the medial condyle, we have the medial epicondyle, and just above the lateral condyle, we have the lateral epicondyle. You can also note that the medial epicondyle is the place of origin of all the flexor muscles in the forearm, which means that these are the muscles that bring about the flexion of the elbow joint. And similarly, the lateral epicondyle is the point of origin for all the extensors that are present in the forearm, which are responsible to bring about the extension of the elbow joint or the entire arm, you can say. Alright, then above the epicondyles, we have got the supraepicondyles, and since this gives us a ridge-like appearance, so above the medial epicondyle, we have got the medial supraepicondylar ridge, and above the lateral epicondyle we have got the lateral supraepicondylar ridge. Alright, here you can see the posterior aspect of the lower end of humerus, and an important feature of the posterior aspect of lower end of humerus is the Olecranon fossa. A fossa is a surface, a depressed surface basically, and it is known as the Olecranon fossa, just like the reason for Coronoid Fossa and the Radial Fossa. The reason behind its name, the Olecranon Fossa, is the Olecranon process, which is a process present in the upper end of ulna bone. And when the elbow joint or when the arm is extended, the Olecranon process of the ulna bone comes in contact with this surface of the lower end of posterior aspect of humerus, which is why the surface is known as the Olecranon fossa. I hope all of this makes sense. Let's learn about the muscle attachments that are associated with the humerus bone. So there are 12 muscles that are attached to the humerus bone. Firstly, we have the deltoid muscle. We have discussed about the origin of the deltoid muscle several times in our previous videos, but its insertion is what is associated with the humerus bone particularly. So if you remember the deltoid tuberosity of humerus, which is present in the anterior-medial surface of the shaft of humerus. So yeah, the deltoid muscle is inserted in the deltoid tuberosity. Then we have the pectoralis major muscle. Here are the 4 points of origin for this muscle, but they are not quite important for this video since we are talking about the humerus bone only. So again, the pectoralis major inserts in the lateral lip of bicipital groove of humerus. The lateral lip of bicipital groove of humerus. Now you can keep this in mind that since in the spelling of pectoralis major we have got this L, this letter L, and the lateral lip, obviously lateral starts with L, so L and L, you can relate that the lateral lip of bicipital groove is associated with the pectoralis major muscle, and I'll tell you ahead why I'm mentioning this LL relationship here. So thirdly, we have the latissimus dorsi muscle, which inserts in the floor of the bicipital groove of humerus. Fourthly, we have the teres major muscle, which inserts in the medial lip of bicipital groove of humerus. Now here comes that point. Alright, so we have 2 muscles here, the pectoralis major muscle and the teres major muscle, and both of these muscles have got their insertions in one of the lips of the bicipital groove. So this is why I mentioned it. By this LL relationship, you can keep in mind that the pectoralis major, because both of these muscles have got major in their terminologies, right? Its insertion is present in the lateral lip, and the insertion for teres major is present in the medial lip of bicipital groove. Moving on to the 5th muscle, coracobrachialis muscle, which inserts in the middle of the medial border of humerus. Then we have the tricep brachii, which is the muscle present in the posterior arm, which is the muscle present in the posterior region of the arm. This muscle consists of 3 heads: the long head, the lateral head, and the medial head. The long head originates in the infraglenoid tubercle of scapula, and the lateral head originates in the the lateral head originates just above the radial groove. Remember we talked about this groove in the posterior aspect of shaft of humerus, right? In the posterior surface of humerus. So just above this groove, we have got the origin for the lateral head of tricep brachii. Then we have the medial head, which originates below the radial groove. Again, an important relationship, an important point to be noted, that the lateral head originates above the radial groove and the medial head originates below the radial groove. Now, let me tell you how I kept this in my mind. So you see, when we say below the radial groove, this term below has got a W at its end, and the W is very similar to M. W is the ulta M, right? So this M and W you can relate, and keep this in mind that the medial head is present below the radial groove and the lateral head, which is obviously the opposite of medial. So yeah, the lateral head is originating above the radial groove. Alright, it's a funny thing, but you can make such relationships to keep things in mind. Alright, the tricep brachii inserts in the Olecranon process of ulna. And we have the bicep brachii. It consists of two heads again, the long head and the short head. And the origin for the long head is the supracondylar tubercle of scapula, and the short head originates in the coracoid process of scapula. Again, these 2 points are not really associated with the humerus bones, but you have to keep them in mind, right? And the bicep brachii inserts in the radial tuberosity, but again, none of these points are associated with the humerus. So yeah. Anyways, let's move on to the brachialis muscle, which originates in the anterior border of the distal half of humerus, and it inserts in the coronoid process and the tuberosity of ulna. The brachioradialis muscle, which originates in the lateral supracondylar ridge of humerus and inserts in the lateral aspect of distal radius, which is the styloid. The anconeus muscle originates in the lateral epicondyle of humerus. The supinator muscle, it originates in the supinator crest of ulna and in the lateral epicondyle of humerus. And finally, we have the pronator teres muscle, which originates in the medial epicondyle of humerus. Now, you are supposed to keep all these pointers in your mind, especially the ones that are associated with the humerus bone. One more very important point that I'd like to mention here, that the groove, the radial groove or the spinal groove, which is present in the posterior surface of, which is present on the posterior surface of the shaft of humerus, is of immense importance because it consists of the radial nerve and the profunda brachii vessels. It is usually asked in your exams to mention the contents of the radial or the spinal groove. So yeah, you must note that they are the radial nerve and the profunda brachii vessels. Alright, so we're done with the humerus bone here. If you have any questions about the humerus bone, its features or the muscle attachments, you can always ask them in the comments section below. So yeah, I hope this was a helpful video again. See you in the next one. Goodbye.